What is going on, guys? Welcome to the Reformed Reader, the channel where we review different forms of media through the lens of a Christian who is under the authority of the scriptures. My name is Josh, and today we are going to be doing a book review of Shadows Upon Time by Christopher Ruocchio. Now, before we jump into anything else, this is the final book in the Sun Eater series. This is book number 7, so there will be light spoilers here. I'll probably touch on some light spoilers from all the other previous books. So again, there are going to be light spoilers. This is book number 7 in the series, but I did a review for every other book, so I needed to get this one out as well. So without any further ado, let's first go over what is this book about. The trumpet sounds. The end has come at last. After his victory at Vorgosis, Hadrian Marlowe finds himself a fugitive, on the run not only from the Extrasolarians, but from his own people, the Solan Empire he betrayed, and who betrayed him. Hidden safely beyond the borders of human space, Hadrian awaits the arrival of the one ally he has left, the Jadian prince Caim Aloran du Otranto. What's more, the inhuman Cielsen have vanished, unseen for more than 100 years. The armies of men have grown complacent, but Hadrian knows the truth. The Cielsen are gathering their strength, preparing for their final assault against the heart of all mankind. Only Hadrian possesses the power to stem the tide, an ancient war machine forged by the demon machines at the dawn of time. The mighty Demiurge. With it, Hadrian must face not just the Cielsen horde, but their prophet king and the dark gods that it serves, the very gods who shape the universe itself. This must be. Okay guys, so if you're new to the channel, the way that I normally structure my reviews is that I go over the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good being the things about the book that I enjoyed, the bad being things that didn't work so well for me, and these are preferential things like maybe the writing style, a character I didn't like, those kind of things. But then I go into the ugly, which is what could be some sin that is steeped into this work that might hold a Christian back from picking it up, and I break that down into 5 categories. But before we get into that, let's first go over the good. So what were some things about Shadows Upon Time that I enjoyed? I don't know that I have enough time to cover it. I mean, this was a very thick book. If I'm not mistaken, if I remember listening to an interview with Christopher Ruocchio, this book is by far the longest in the series, and I think it's the longest by like 150,000 words or somewhere in that ballpark. So yeah, this is a big, thick book. So this is probably for most people 2 or 3 books combined into one big fat one. I'm not saying that that's how he designed it or anything, but it is a lot. So there's a lot here to like. There's a lot in this book. There's a lot contained here. Now, obviously, what did I like? The characters are just as good as they've always been, if not better in some ways. And I don't want to get too far into who those characters are in case you haven't even started the series yet, which thank you for watching this video, I guess. If you're sitting there thinking, what are Josh's final thoughts? Maybe I can clear the air a little bit. But yeah, the characters are fantastic. But the main reason that you read this series is you're reading it for the plot. You're reading it for the story. And you know the end of the story before you begin. And I love that in the interview that I listened to with Christopher Ruocchio, when he was discussing the series, he said that he actually wrote the series, or that the series, the structure of the series stemmed from spoiler culture, meaning, people are complaining about spoilers everywhere. Well, if you read the back of the book, that's a spoiler. Oh, you told me a character is alive in book 2. That's a spoiler. I guess anything could be classified as a spoiler. And then, so it just muddies the waters up. So in the first few sentences of the series, we're told that Hadrian Marlowe destroys the sun. That's why it's called the Sun Eater series, and that he essentially commits genocide. So you know what's going to happen before the story even really takes off. So it's not so much of what's going to happen. You know what's going to happen to a degree. However, it's how it happened, why it happened, who it happened to, all of those things that you find out, and everything is wrapped up in this novel. What did I like? Obviously, Hadrian Marlowe is, for me, he's a legacy character. He'll go down as one of my favorite characters of all time. Cassandra is also a favorite. And then there were a few others that, again, I just don't really want to get too far into for the sake of saving for those spoilers. But just know that the character work here is exemplary. Obviously, again, the plot is fantastic. But this world, even though it's so fantastical and so outlandish, it feels real. It feels lived in. You're invested in this world. You're invested not just in the characters, but you're invested in what is going to happen to the Empire and all of the people that live in it. The innocents and those kind of things. So you're certainly bought in quite a bit to what is taking place in this story. So yeah, the characters and the plot predominantly were my favorite parts. And honestly, it coming to an end was something that I really enjoyed. And I mean that in almost every way. I loved that he was finally able to wrap it up. I loved that this wasn't one of those series that where the author goes, I know I said I was going to wrap it up after this, but I'm going to cash in on that cow as often as possible and keep returning to that world because people are going to keep buying books regardless of the quality of the series or universe. So I love that he began the story with the end in mind. Now, he may not have known exactly how he wanted to get there. And he certainly, I think he figured it out along the way in many ways. But I love that he began this series with the end in mind. He knew where he wanted to take it. And he was like, yeah, this is where the story begins. This is essentially where the story ends. And I think that's one of the things that is so endearing about the series is that he just wanted to tell this story to its completion. Now, there's all kinds of other things that I loved about this series. But if I'm talking about this book in particular, the Demiurge was one of the coolest things. Also, the character Orphan. What a unique character. What a strange, vile, unique character. That's a crazy one. How Christopher Rocchio concocted that in his mind makes me wonder about several things. But yeah, Orphan was so cool, and I loved the mystique behind him. So again, I just absolutely loved the story now being able to look back in retrospect and be able to appreciate a lot of the things that maybe didn't work as well for me in the series prior, particularly with book one. It's not me, I know everybody wants to dunk on book one. I had issues with it for a different reason. I didn't think the writing was bad or anything like that. And you guys can go and see my review and see all my thoughts and opinions there. But I now understand a lot of the choices that he made. Now, whether he corrected that while writing the series or while wrapping it up, or that was his plan all along, it doesn't really matter at this point. But I will say that I personally think that he stuck the landing. So now let's talk about the bad. So what were some things about this book that I didn't enjoy? And sadly, there's a few things. Number one is its length. This is too long. I'm just trying to give you guys my completely unfiltered thoughts. I don't have anything written out here. I'm just trying to talk to you guys. And as if you were asking me, hey, should I read this book? Or should I read this series? What do you think? Is it worth it? I think this book in particular was too long. I think there's quite a bit of fat that could have been trimmed here. And we probably could have had maybe 100 pages less. And I think maybe I'm being generous there. We probably could have had less than that. And it would have been much tighter. But I will say my biggest gripe with this book, well, I guess the two biggest gripes. Number one was the pacing. The pacing is sort of what you can expect. Like if you've read up to this book, but you haven't read this book yet, you kind of know what to expect with the pacing. There's certainly peaks and valleys. I think that most of the time, those valleys are intentional. I think in this book, maybe we lingered there a little long, and maybe it wasn't his intention for there to necessarily be a valley there. And maybe he just wanted us to be able to take a breath in between big events. But I think it was just too long. So I think if, this would have been trimmed down a little bit, I personally would have enjoyed it more. And again, these are personal preference things, but my biggest gripe with this book is the beginning. It's about I would say probably the first 20% of this book I was not a fan of. And let me explain why without going into spoilers. If you've read book 6, we come to a very hard stop at the end of book 6. And this is if you guys have read the series, you know that he typically does these time jumps between books with one exception. And I think he just kind of wanted to follow that format a little bit, but I don't think we needed that time jump. And what that caused was Rockio then had to tell us, the audience, in retrospect, what had occurred. And the way that he chose to do that, I'll say this, if he was just dead set on doing that, then he probably did it in the best way that he could. However, I certainly think that it was not my preference. So what he did was he wanted to show people that he could write multi POVs in a singular POV story. So rather than show us what happened immediately after the end of book 6. And again, I'm just trying to dodge spoilers here. But immediately after, I was really hoping for him to launch us straight into the final book. He could have done that, and I personally think it would have worked so much better. But because he tends to be an antagonist to the naysayers who say, well, you can only write a single POV. It just goes to show you can't write multi-POV. He's like, okay, watch this. And so to kind of prove a point, and again, this was talked about in numerous interviews, to sort of prove that point, we have this time jump, and then Hadrian goes and meets with a certain individual, and they're asking,
what happened?
And you're sort of left disoriented. And this happened with me at the beginning of book 2. This happened a little bit at the beginning of book 3, not as bad, but I was just sort of disoriented. I was like, hold on a second. He's a fugitive, and he's like everything that you heard in the section where I was talking about what the book was about sort of like got just thrown at you. I was like, hold on. I must have not have been paying attention at the end of book 6 because I don't remember people chasing him or him killing anybody or anything like that. I don't remember any of that. And then you find out, it's like, oh, it's because there is a time jump. These things happened, and now he has to go back and tell somebody what happened. And then from there, other characters step in and say, well, let me tell this part of the story because I was the one that experienced it. You're dealing with like multi POVs in a singular point of view, which was interesting, but completely unnecessary in my opinion. So I think Rockio going to prove a point was a detriment to the final book because it really sucked the life out of that first 20%. It really hit me in a negative way with the pacing. I thought like, man, I was making sure I wasn't the only one. I was texting several of my buddies and I'm like, hey, does this get better? Because I'm struggling here. They're all like, yes, it does. It's just, some decisions that he made. I guess he has the freedom to do that, especially with this being the very end of his book, which is in part why I think the book is so long, is he's like, hey, this is the final book. So I kind of have a little bit of free reign. But again, the beginning just didn't work for me at all. I enjoyed what happened, but it would have been far more enjoyable for the reader if we got to experience it with Hadrian, but instead it's like we're sitting at the table and these other characters are telling us what happened. Man, I was just bored to death that first 20%. And 20% of this book, just to give you an idea, the hardcover is 900 pages. So 20% of this book is almost 200 pages, so it's like, okay, we need to get going here. And so that's how I kind of felt. So those are my two biggest gripes. Otherwise, I was impressed. So this brings me to the ugly, which is, what is some sin that could be steeped in this work that might hold a Christian back from picking it up? And I break this down into 5 categories, and I rate them on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most severe, starting with violence and brutality. Now, for violence and brutality, I'm going to say this is very average for the Sun Eater books. So I'm going to give this, if I were to just rate this book alone on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm going to say it's somewhere between a 6 and a 7. So let's just put it in a 7 for the sake of argument. So there's a lot of violence here. There's a lot of brutality here. There's a lot that takes place. Obviously it's the Sun Eater. He's finally able to complete his task of becoming the Sun Eater and wiping out essentially an entire race. And so, yeah, there's a lot of violence here. However, I will say that if you've read up to this point and you have no qualms about the levels of violence and brutality, I don't think you'll be surprised at all here. If you're unsure of the entire series, yeah, there's some very violent and brutal parts in the series overall. But for today, I just want to focus on this. Maybe I'll touch on the entire series as a whole at a later date. But for right now, for the violence and brutality, I am going to put it at about a 7. So this brings me to category 2, which is sexually explicit content. Now, for sexually explicit content, I'm going to give this a flat 4. So yeah, kind of middle of the road, probably a little less than middle of the road. So there's one character that came up early on in book 6. And again, I'm just trying to avoid spoilers here. So if you've read it, you know who I'm referring to when I talk about this one female character who seemed to have the inclination that she didn't need to have a wardrobe. That character is obviously in here again. If you've read book 6, you know what I'm talking about. But there really isn't anything sexually explicit in here. But I'm just trying to err on the side of caution for you, the viewer. If you're like, I've never read the series, I don't know anything about it, where would you put it? I mean, probably a 4, and that's me being pretty extreme. I think it's probably actually much less than that, but it also has been a little bit since I've read this. So, roast me in the comments and tell me I'm wrong. Overall, I'm going to put it about a 4. There's some, more sensual scenes, but there is one character in particular who is a temptress, of sorts. So yeah, for sexually explicit content, I don't think it's really there. I don't think there's enough there to hold a Christian back from picking it up, but it entirely depends on you. For me personally, I'm going to put it in a 4. So this brings me to category 3, which is language. And for language, I'm going to give this a 3. So it's not really in here. I would say that this has less language than many of the middle books, and there's reasons why, and I won't get into that. If you know, you know. Yeah, I will say that there's not a ton here, but there are times where the language can be severe. There's a few bombs that are dropped here and there. And again, you're dealing with a 1,000-page book, so I can't tell you precisely where or exactly how many. I do know that they were present. So, this is one of those questions that people ask all the time. It's like, well, would you listen to this as an audiobook over like a loudspeaker? And the answer is maybe. I would say it's so few and far between that depending on whose little ears I'm worried about overhearing something, I don't think it's going to be anything really that's going to give me pause. However, sometimes something gets thrown in there. So I would say use your own judgment there. I would say this book, as far as language goes, is probably PG-13, but it probably leans more towards PG, but there just are PG-13 moments. So this brings me to category 4, which is gratuitous inclusions. Now for gratuitous inclusions, I'm going to give this a 0. There's nothing really here, nothing that I can point at and say, there's inclusion here of some sort, or somebody's trying to preach at us in some sort of way, or what? No, it's not there. Rocky O's just wrapping up his series. So I personally didn't think it was there. So I think you're safe as far as that goes. And the final category is dark themes. Now for dark themes, I'm going to give this a 4. And the reason I'm going to give this a 4 is because there's a little more heavy themes, but there is darkness here. But keep in mind, it's not glorified. Hadrian is actively fighting against the servants of darkness. So then why am I giving it a 4? Because there are some heavier topics here. There's some heavier questions that get asked. Like, what's your definition of humanity? How would we define humanity? Is everything morally black and white? Is there an objective standard for all things? And so does that mean that the elimination of an entire race, is that morally righteous, or is it unrighteous, or is it somewhere in between? So there's some heavier philosophical questions that get asked here. And I think people are going to land in different parts of the spectrum, or different parts of the little Venn diagram. I think some people are going to champion the things Hadrian does. I think some people are going to criticize the things Hadrian does. And then I think some people are going to see the pros and cons of both and maybe just see it as a necessity. But do I think it's anything heavy that's going to keep a Christian from picking it up? I personally don't think so. Again, if you've read up to book 6 and you're at book number 7, I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. So this leads me to the final question, which is, would I recommend this to a Christian? And the answer is, I absolutely would. It is going to take a certain individual. I would not recommend this to all Christians, because I wouldn't recommend this series to all Christians. But to any Christian who loves sci-fi, and fantasy and loves to see some allegorical things interwoven into the story and actually be sort of like the underlying current, I think you'll have a lot to love here. I will say that it's very slow in the beginning. And so if you're like, oh man, does this get better? The answer is yes, it does. If you had an experience like me, hopefully I can be that voice of reason that says press on, because I believe that it is worth it. So would I recommend it to a Christian? Yes, I would. Just to wrap all this up with a nice tidy bow, there were some things in here that I really enjoyed, some things that I can't talk about without giving away a bunch of spoilers. And maybe I'll just do like a spoiler discussion of the entire series. I don't know. That might be cool to do with a friend or two, but there is some great allegory here. There are times where I'm like, okay, there's some really interesting things going on that I think that C.S. Lewis would enjoy, or you can certainly see how Tolkien influenced him in a few ways. But overall, I really, really enjoyed this. I do think it was a little too long. I do think it was a little too bloated. I do think that it dragged at times, but I do think that he stuck the landing, and I'm so glad that I finished the series because it has become an all-timer for me. It is probably in my top 3 favorite series of all time. Now, if you were to ask me, Josh, where do you rank this book in the series overall? It's probably going to be pretty low. So I would say the Empire of Silence is probably my lowest rank, and then this may be right above it. Probably is. It probably goes Empire of Silence, and then Shadows Upon Time, followed by, personally, probably Kingdoms of Death. And it's because I had a difficult time reading it. I had the enjoyment kind of ruined for me, and go and look at my review for that and you'll see why. I couldn't enjoy it as much. I am actually excited to reread that one because I can reread it in a different headspace, and I think I'll get a lot more out of it. And then it's probably Demon in White, Howling Dark, Ashes of Man, Disquiet Gods. So Disquiet Gods is probably my favorite of the series. So yeah, there you go. That's the last book, and this is the last book review I will be doing on Sun Eater, unless I get to the novellas, which I probably will do when we do a reread. But yeah, fantastic series. One of the greatest of all time, in my opinion. So glad. And it's going to make me pick up anything that Chris Verrocchio writes from here on. So guys, thank you so much for coming along with me on this Sun Eater journey, especially when you guys can see my own personal peaks and valleys with this series. I appreciate you guys hanging out with me and listening to me ramble about this really nerdy but very philosophical book that hits home a lot of times. So thank you guys for hanging out with me. Guys, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing. But more than anything, I would ask that you would share these videos with your Christian brothers and sisters who love to read, so that maybe I could be a good resource to them, so that maybe we could spend our time, money, and energy a little more wisely on things that honor the Lord. So again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you on the next one.